Thank you all for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kate Barnico. I'm one of the co-presidents of Student Animal Legal Defense Fund here. We want to very quickly thank Women's Law Association also for co-sponsoring this event. I'll do a quick introduction of our speaker today, and then we can go ahead and get started. Feel free to get seconds or firsts and just take a seat when y'all are ready. So our speaker today is Daina Bray. As General Counsel, Daina leads IFAW's legal team and advises on all aspects of legal risk and governance to support IFAW's efforts to rescue and protect animals around the world. Daina works closely with the boards of directors, CEO, and senior management on legal issues and risk management, and collaborates with IFAW teams across country offices and departments to resolve legal issues. Since joining IFAW in 2014, Daina has managed corporate governance for IFAW's offices in 16 countries, including establishing new entities to support IFAW's strategic vision. Daina advises on all legal aspects of IFAW's activities, including in relation to contracts, data protection, fundraising, insurance, and animal law issues. Prior to joining IFAW, Daina practiced litigation and international arbitration with private law firms for 9 years. Daina received her JD from Stanford Law School with pro bono distinction and her BA in international studies from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill as a Moorhead Scholar. Following college, Daina spent a year as a Fulbright Scholar in Kingston, Jamaica, working on environmental education projects. Daina is chair of the American Bar Association Animal Law Committee and is admitted to practice law in Massachusetts and New York. You all join me in thanking Daina for being with us today.
Thank you so much. And you can give me cues on the volume. It sounds pretty loud, actually. How's that? Is that all right? Can you hear me in the back? Yes. Thank you. It's really a privilege to be here today. In particular, I've been watching the development of the new animal law and policy program at Harvard, and it's just so wonderful to see it growing and blossoming under Chris's leadership. So it's really exciting to be here and see all of you interested in hearing from me. I'm honored. I wanted to say thank you to the Student Animal Legal Defense Fund for having me, and also to the Women's Law Association. And also thank you, Chris, for inviting me today, and for all of the support that you've shown to me over the years. I think I've known Chris maybe about 7 years, and through the American Bar Association Animal Law Committee. And that was a long time before I had a job in animal law. It was just something that I was interested in and passionate about and doing in my spare time. And Chris is a wonderful champion for helping people find their way into the field and into the movement, and I'm really grateful for it. So thank you. Yeah, and being here today is another great opportunity for me, so thank you. I also wanted to point out to you here today, I think they're getting food, so I'll call them out. But you have a couple of other really great resources in the room today. Kaylin LaBarge is the General Counsel of Animals Equality, and Sarah Pickering is the International Development Director for Animals Equality. So that's a really wonderful group, and I'm sure they'd love to talk to you after the presentation. I wanted to start, we called this talk Representing International Nonprofits, a View from the Desk of the General Counsel of the International Fund for Animal Welfare. And I just wanted to start by getting a sense of what brought you here today. So I'm going to give you a few options, and then I'll ask you to raise your hand for sort of the angle that interests you the most. So the options I'm going to give you are, first, are you here because you're interested in a legal career helping animals, or you're interested in animal law? That would be the first option. 2, are you here because you're interested in international nonprofits and what it's like to have a legal career with international nonprofits? Or 3, are you really interested in the in-house perspective, what it's like to be a general counsel? And I'm not going to ask you if you're really here for the food, because I'll just, I'll feel uncomfortable then if that's the real reason. So just raise your hand for the reason, your top reason for being here. 1, is it the animal law, legal careers for animal aspect? Great, great. 2, are you most interested in hearing about working at an international nonprofit? Great, good mix, good mix. And how about anybody here primarily to hear an in-house view? Cool, okay. Great, thank you. So I'm just to give you a sense of the context in which I practice law, I wanted to start with a brief overview of the International Fund for Animal Welfare where I work. And also, I can't do one of these without some animal pictures, so that's the main purpose. Our mission is to rescue and protect animals around the world. Some groups focus on individual animals, and some groups are most concerned about protecting groups of animals, populations, and their habitat. IFAW's niche is to work through on-the-ground immediate projects that benefit individual animals, paired with long-term strategic campaigns that assist species and habitat through policy change and protecting large landscapes. An important characteristic of IFAW, and we'll talk about this more later, is that we're a truly international organization with offices in 16 countries and local leadership and experts around the world. That's very much a part of IFAW's DNA. Another part of our DNA is that we work across a large number of issues affecting animals. So just to give you a little sense of the kinds of issues we work on, we have an animal rescue program that includes our marine mammal rescue and research team. They're a global leader in rescuing stranded marine mammals. They do peer-reviewed research. They're always looking at what works and what doesn't because they want to increase the survival rate of the mammals that they're helping to release into the wild. This team works out of our Cape Cod headquarters. They deploy staff, specialized response equipment, and volunteers to respond to stranded marine mammals all along the Cape down to the Rhode Island border. They also travel around the world and train responders about how to properly respond to strandings around the world. As part of our animal rescue team, we also have a disaster response program. So like everyone in this space, it's been an incredibly busy time for IFAW and for our teams. We deployed to Houston after Harvey. We went to Antigua, Barbuda, St. John, and St. Thomas after Irma. We've just been to Dominica doing a wildlife assessment after the Hurricane Maria. We assisted with a response in Mexico in September after the earthquake there. We have a long-standing project in Playa del Carmen, so we were well placed to respond to that. And we are constantly responding to disasters. We're always walking the line of ensuring that animals are assisted, but also that we're not getting in the way of the human assistance projects, which are also happening around the same time. So it's a very interesting, dynamic area, and I'm really proud and moved by our work in that area. We also have a really wonderful wildlife rehabilitation and release program. So we support lots of great projects around the world where the goal is to help wildlife that have gotten into some difficult situation, usually caused by humans, and seeing if it's possible to get them rehabilitated and released into the wild. And if it's not, then our aim is to get them into a high welfare sanctuary situation. This is a picture from an orphan bear project that we supported in Russia for a long time. It's a wonderful project. We support an elephant orphanage project in Zambia, wildlife rescue centers in India, a really cool raptor rescue center that's right in the middle of Beijing that I was able to visit last year. So it's right in the middle of the city. These really incredible raptors get hit by cars and other horrible things, and they're able to be nursed back to health, and then most of them released, which is great. And we've also successfully rehabilitated and released tigers in the far east of Russia. That was something that a lot of conservation experts said would not be possible to do. But we have, these scientists working on that have raised tiger cubs, who were orphaned or captured from the wildlife trade, to adults and released them. And one of those tigers, her name is Zalushka, and we've captured her now in the forest on movement-sensitive cameras with her 2 babies. So she has successfully bred and reproduced in the wild. So it's really inspiring. We also have great companion animal projects around the world, primarily in underserved communities. I mentioned the Playa del Carmen project. We have longstanding projects in South Africa and also in Bosnia, where we work together with the UN Development Program. So we do this. We do lots of work to protect elephants. I'm sure you're all aware of the incredibly damaging effects that ivory poaching has had on elephants. It's sad because this was an issue, when I was much younger. There was really widespread decimation of elephant populations, which was stopped, and it has unfortunately peaked again in 2011, although we are making progress in slowing it down. So IFAW works on both sides of that issue, both protecting landscapes and rehabilitating elephants in Africa, but also we do a ton of work around the world, and especially in China, working to reduce the demand for wildlife products and ivory in particular. So we are committed to rescuing individual animals, creating safe spaces for them, and then making the policy changes and the consumer behavior changes that will protect them in the long run. So we do this through a somewhat complex corporate structure. So we have offices in 16 countries. That's a mix of sort of freestanding registered companies and branch and representative offices. That's another way that international nonprofits operate around the world. We do support projects in countries where we're not present, dozens and dozens of more countries. And when we're operating in a country where we don't have a corporate presence, we always have to be careful about the tax issues and not, entering a country without, registering when it's required. That's a key issue for in-house lawyers everywhere. We have about 270 employees around the world and an annual operating budget of about $75 million. So this is, it's a fairly complex structure. I kind of think of us as a mid-sized international nonprofit, but we are, I think, because we've been so international for so long, it's not a setup where, it's the U.S. entity that is the parent company for everybody else. We do have these freestanding companies that are well established. Before they created my position, the in-house counsel position in 2014, IFAW had been around since 1969, but had never had an attorney in-house. They certainly worked with outside attorneys. They worked with auditors and consultants, but they never had somebody inside kind of looking around and trying to help them manage their legal problems. And so the experience of being the first lawyer in the door at any organization is an amazing experience. And when you meet another lawyer who's been through it, you feel this kinship. So I know, Caitlin, that's you. Because you're learning about the organization, you're learning, about maybe areas of law that you haven't been exposed to before, but you're also trying to get the organization to learn about you and what you have to offer and how you can help them do their work. And I think particularly being in-house at a nonprofit, it really helps to be mission committed and to communicate that to your colleagues, because a lot of times lawyers are seen as the department of no. People say that a lot, and sometimes I am the department of no, like heck no sometimes. But you want to give your client, your in-house clients, you want to give them the impression that you're there to support them and make things happen and find creative solutions, and that's an important skill, of any in-house lawyer in any environment. One of the things that you'll notice from my presentation is that to be in-house, they always say, you have to be a mile wide in the areas of law that you're willing to work on. And you may only be an inch deep, but you have to sort of be able to field things as they come in. And you have to know enough to be able to make risk assessments and decide where your time is merited and decide where it's high risk enough, it's important enough that you may need to invest the funds in expert outside counsel, in Australia on this particular fundraising law issue, whatever it is. So that's actually, I find it to be the most challenging aspect of my job, is trying to decide where me and my team should spend our time. When can we just kind of say, we feel fairly confident this is fine, get on with the work, and we're going to prioritize other matters. It's different. My first 10 years of practice were with law firms in litigation and arbitration. And there you're sort of trained to turn over every stone, exhaust the research, you not be surprised by anything. And you can't operate like that as an in-house lawyer. You just don't have the time. So that's been a challenge and something that I'm learning over time. I wanted to just share with you, to give you a sense of the kind of issues that come up at international nonprofits, and with a special focus on the kind of issues that come up for animal organizations. Starting with fundraising, in any company, where your revenues come from is a huge issue, and in the nonprofit context, it's fundraising. And so it's important, if you're representing a nonprofit, that you're up to speed and compliant on all the rules that apply to your fundraising activities. And it's quite a complicated landscape, because there are rules that apply specifically to charities and how they can fundraise. But then there's other broader rules that also apply to you, consumer protection rules, if you're doing telemarketing, telecommunication rules. So you have to really make sure that you're aware of the broader landscape that you're fundraising in. And this is actually it's a very technical aspect of my practice, because we have lots of different fundraising channels in lots of different countries, and each one has different rules that apply to it. So we fundraise by postal mail, phone, text. We do face-to-face fundraising. That's where somebody approaches you in the street and says, you want to learn more about IFAW and our work to protect elephants. That's notorious for generating a high rate of complaints. But it's also notorious for generating long-standing, sustaining givers. So you have to evaluate each one of these methods and decide, is this right for my organization and how I want to interact with our supporters. And then there's all these emerging technologies. Like I'm constantly asked about things I have never considered before. There's lots of creative new ways to communicate with your audience on social media, to purchase advertising on social media. There's new Facebook donate buttons, Facebook custom audiences. I think it will not be long, before you can tell Amazon's Alexa, like, hey, make a $100 donation to IFAW, from my living room. I think that's coming, and I have no idea what the regulatory issues there are, but I'll have to look into it. So fundraising it's a complicated and it's important area. You also, in order to fundraise as a charity, because as a charity you enjoy lots of tax protections and exemptions, you have to, in a lot of places, register to fundraise, and that's like another important compliance aspect for nonprofits. To give you some specific animal sector examples, so like how does this play out in the animal law or animal org field? There's fundraising rules about how you use images and distressing subject matter to raise funds from your supporters. So in a lot of markets, it's not allowed to use a graphic image for the intent of distressing someone so that they then feel compelled to give to your organization. So you have to ask yourself, a really hard question. Am I sharing this picture, which might be disturbing because it's really necessary to educate people about what's happening to animals? Or if I'm sharing this picture because I think it's going to distress people and they're going to give, that's inappropriate. So you always have to think about how you're communicating with your audience. And then, there's also, in different jurisdictions, there can be specific rules that target animal organizations in a way that I think is unfair, but they nonetheless happen. An example of this, thankfully, it didn't get put into law, but last year there were proposed state bills in Oklahoma and Missouri that would have prohibited a so-called animal rights charitable organization from fundraising in state if they wanted to either spend that money out of state or if they wanted to use it for political purposes, which was not clearly defined. So if that had passed, and it hasn't yet, they're still kicking around in committee, but they've been dormant for a long time, that would have run afoul of constitutional protections that the Supreme Court has enunciated over and over again, that the nonprofit's right to fundraise is a highly, highly protected form of expression. So what this would have done is if you raised funds in Oklahoma, you would have had to spend them inside the state, which would have been a interference with interstate commerce also, and impermissible on that ground, but also prohibiting you from spending those funds on for political purposes, which was vague and not defined, and you could see could have been used to target particular viewpoints in an impermissible way. One of the co-sponsors of the Oklahoma bill stated in a hearing that the bill was motivated in part by a desire to prevent national groups like the Humane Society of the United States from fundraising in Oklahoma and then spending it out of state. Another one of the co-sponsors said in hearing that one of his motivations for adding the political purposes language was to limit fundraising to fight against the Oklahoma Right to Farm bill. So that would have been a legislative activity that was clearly targeted at animal rights activists, which also wasn't defined in the law what that meant. So those are the kind of things that can happen, and actually similar things are happening in the international context, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Another area, and this is also a highly technical area that comes up all the time, is data protection. So any in-house lawyer, this is like right at the top of your list now. And particularly if you're a multinational company and you have operations in Europe especially, this is like this is an existential issue that you have to get your arms around. There's two aspects to data protection. There's data security, so that's what are you doing to protect the data that you hold? Are your firewalls strong enough? Have you done penetration tests? Are you making sure that hackers can't get at the confidential data that you hold? The other aspect is more of a data privacy, data use aspect. So the way that plays out for a nonprofit is, how am I using my donors' personal information, and am I using it consistent with how they expect me to use it or how they've given me permission to use it? So that's something that, for a nonprofit, our donor supporter base is our greatest asset, and like maintaining loyalty and trust with our donors is really important. And one of the things that's so crucial now is how we handle their data. Also, as an employer, we handle confidential employee data all the time, and we also have to treat that very carefully. So this space around personal data is just getting more and more regulated around the world. There was a very strict privacy law in Australia that passed in 2014. Canada, in the last couple of years, has tightened up restrictions on emailing, so that affects nonprofits. Lots of countries have put stronger data security laws in place. China and Russia have laws requiring you to keep personal information about their citizens within their own country. It's a very aggressive law. And then, of course, we have the EU General Data Protection Regulation, which is coming into force in May of 2018. Every business in the world is struggling to comply with this regulation because it really changes the landscape of how you can process the personal data of European residents, and really increases the possible rate of fines that can be levied. So it's a very important area. All of these data protection restrictions, I mean, frankly, if I think about it from a consumer's point of view, I wish that personally we had protections like this more in the US. The US is so far behind the EU in terms of how we protect personal data and privacy. But from the perspective of a nonprofit, it really does limit your ability to communicate with the public and with your supporters sometimes the way that you want to. So as an in-house attorney with a nonprofit, you want to make sure that you're complying with the laws, but you also want to make sure that you're not going so far that you're sort of making it impossible to communicate effectively with your supporters, or you're not really disadvantaging yourself against other competitors in your space. Another example of an area that any international nonprofit attorney would work on is sanctions. So there are different countries have different restrictions for different reasons about sending money into other countries. We worked on a great project that I really enjoyed. We were in touch with an animal rescuer in a conflict zone in a sanctioned country who had a number of dogs in his care that were in danger and in need of rescue. So we needed to send money into that country to get the dogs microchipped, vaccinated, and transported out, but we weren't allowed to do that without US government permission. So with the help of a very good friend from law school, who's now a big law partner who did all this work with us for free, which is awesome. So stay in touch with your law school friends. It's really, I've been out, I guess, I graduated in 2004, and all of a sudden all my friends have these great jobs. It's pretty cool. So we got in touch with the US government, and we got permission to send funds into this country to get the dogs out, and it was a successful rescue, and it was a really fun piece of legal work. That's kind of to me, my favorite part of my job, when I can see that my legal work directly benefited animals. And one of those dogs, when they got over to the US shelters here that we were partnering with, they were staying with until they were adopted, the shelter discovered the dog had a contagious disease and couldn't stay in the shelter. So this is my new dog, who I love. So she's all better now. She's cured. And she's my hands-on, IFAW project in my house every day, which I really love. But that is, having been in private practice, doing litigation and international arbitration for almost 10 years, I can't tell you how deeper my level of satisfaction is with my job. Now that I know, even if I'm working on data protection or fundraising rules, just knowing that the end goal is a better world for animals and people, I feel a lot more satisfied and comfortable in my own life. I always kind of imagined I would feel like that, but I really do feel like that, which is cool. Other areas that you work on as an in-house lawyer for an international nonprofit: intellectual property. This is an area I had no experience in, so you have to kind of learn things quickly. Are you protecting your trademarks? That's your name and your logo. Are you protecting your copyrighted materials? Are you not infringing other people's intellectual property rights? And an interesting thing that comes up a lot between animal organizations is somebody will have a phrase that seems pretty generic, like maybe animal rescuer. That's maybe a little too generic, but you will sort of start inadvertently using a phrase like that, and then discover that another nonprofit has been using it for 20 years and they have it trademarked. And it's funny, I've been on both sides of this, and it's kind of cool because the animal organizations, like, you don't want to stop the other group from doing it. Like, you want to protect your trademark, and if they ever started using that trademark for some purpose that is inconsistent with your values, you would want to be able to stop it. But if they've already invested funds in setting up their website and putting materials out, you don't want to undermine that. So we end up like sending each other letters like, just so you know, that's my trademark, and I'm okay with it for now if you use it as you're using it, but I might come back later and tell you, I just got one of those the other day, and I send them out too. But so it's kind of it's a nice ethic because we're all in it for the same reasons, and when organizations behave like that, it really feels good. Another, of course, if you're in-house anywhere, you deal with employment law matters. You deal with disputes that may arise with your employees. And then you also deal with just sort of basic workplace issues about employee safety. And if you are an international nonprofit deploying people to disaster zones or conflict areas, you have to really, that's an area that you really have to focus on. You have to have pre-trip assessments. Is this a good idea? You have to make sure that, folks have access to the advanced information they need, that you have a way to contact them. We now have subscribed to a service where everybody has a mobile app on their phone that they have to check in every time they move. They're automatically pushed out security alerts. And then, we've had to evacuate people, too. And you have to make sure that you have, because they've had a medical emergency or just got to be, a place where we didn't want them to be anymore. So those are, again, any in-house lawyer deals with employee safety issues, whether it's just like, how your desk is set up. But then, when you're in the international area, those issues can get more complex. Also, as a nonprofit, there's a lot of grant rules. If we're giving out money, what are we doing to make sure that it's being spent consistently with our charitable purpose? If we're receiving money, there's always tons of requirements on us about reporting on how it's spent, accountability, impact reporting. So that's a part of your practice. Governance matters. A big part of my job is to advise the board on their legal risks. As an in-house lawyer, you are the company's lawyer, and you have an obligation to act in the best interests of the company. And part of that is advising the board on difficult issues when they come up. So that's dynamic for any in-house lawyer in any company. I deal with insurance issues. I deal with contract issues. But again, sometimes my contract is, a lot of times we work in the US to transfer captive big cats from a low welfare situation to a high welfare animal sanctuary. And so then I'll advise on the contract that transfers ownership of the big cat. And that raises interesting issues that sort of have been looked at by animal lawyers in the shelter context in terms of transferring ownership of companion animals. But then when it's a tiger, maybe you need to be thinking about different insurance requirements, or who's responsible for the tiger while it's in transit, because heaven forbid, that could be a big issue. The last sort of particular area I wanted to talk about is just a comment about the climate for international NGOs around the world. This is something that, I have seen in my own work life, and that you see in the pages of, the New York Times every day. There's really a growing trend in a number of countries for foreign NGOs or domestic NGOs that get foreign funding, or even sometimes just domestic NGOs, to be targeted with burdensome regulation by the host country. And it's often focused on human rights groups or rule of law groups that are perceived as threatening to the government of the host country. But of course, any international NGO can fall within the scope of these rules, and it can be very burdensome to operate in these environments. And I think it's really a shame, because in a number of countries, you're seeing international NGOs pull out, and you're losing the investment that they were making in making life better in many ways in that country. So just some examples. Most recently in August, the Cambodian Prime Minister ordered a US-based group called Agape International Missions to end its operations in that country. That was after that group was featured in a CNN report about sex trafficking in Cambodia. So that was perceived as not appreciated by the government, and they were booted out. In India, it's been very dramatic. Since 2014, the Indian government has denied licenses allowing international NGOs to transfer funds into the country 11,000 times. Those license applications have been denied. So, I have friends that were not registered in India, but I have friends that work at nonprofits that are registered in India, and they just can't get money in. So they have this, company there that was doing good work, and they're no longer able to get funds in. In Turkey, the government recently revoked the registration of Mercy Corps. That was a group that was assisting Syrian refugees in Turkey. In Hungary, the government just enacted very very broad laws requiring NGOs that receive foreign funding to publicly identify themselves and their donors, which is a very burdensome thing to have to do. In Hungary, that was Hungary. In Egypt, there's also a burdensome new law. Some of the countries that we work in Australia, there's been a real effort by some politicians to target environmental groups and say that environmental groups that are too politically active shouldn't get tax-deductible status. This seems to be targeting groups like Greenpeace, which are speaking out very loudly against mining in Australia. In Kenya, we've been present in Kenya for a long time. All of a sudden, the government is starting to enforce an NGO act that's been around since 1990 that they never enforced before. They're starting to enforce it against rule of law groups in Kenya. And then a really prominent example is China. There was a new foreign NGO law enacted in China. It took effect January 1st, 2017, and that has really changed the way international nonprofits can operate in China. It used to be that there was a very sort of well-known and well-utilized gray space for international nonprofits to be present in China. What the new law did was criminalize operations in China without being registered with the government, and it also transferred oversight of international nonprofits from the Civil Affairs Ministry, which was perceived as fairly friendly, to the Public Security Bureau, which is, the very serious public security enforcement mechanism in China. And you now, in order to get registered, have to be linked to a government-sponsoring agency. You can't get registered unless you have a government agency. The Chinese law for that, the Chinese word for that government agency translates as mother-in-law. So you have to find a mother-in-law agency that reviews your project plans every year and is sort of, engaged with you in a way that we're not, I'm not used to doing in most of the jurisdictions that we operate in. So any questions about any of those substantive areas of my practice?
Got a microphone too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, the mic?
And the other, I'm happy to talk about, depending on what your interests are, my career path or finding a job in animal law. Oh yeah, sure. I will just quickly give a plug for the American Bar Association has a wonderful animal law committee. I'm the chair of it this year. Chris was the chair several years ago. It's been a wonderful opportunity for me to learn more about animal law and network with animal lawyers around the country. And the great news is that it is free to join the ABA for law students. It's totally free. And actually, we're making it very easy for you. If you are not a member of the ABA and you'd like to sign up today, you can just fill out this sheet, and we will go through all the onerous registration process. Yes?
I've got a question.
Yeah.
How many other, now you're the first one through the door, how many other attorneys do you have working with you now on all these issues?
So, yeah, I was the first one in the door, and what I immediately realized was I need a corporate paralegal because, with all of these companies having all of these documentation and registration requirements and governance requirements, so we added a corporate paralegal fairly quickly, and I now also have a deputy general counsel, so that's wonderful because you're really able to get through more issues. And just recently, I this is a long-standing position, a paralegal overseeing our U.S. fundraising registrations and estate administration. A lot of people leave very generous gifts in their will. And when we advertised, that position became open, we advertised the paralegal position, we got tons of lawyer applicants. There's a lot of lawyers that want to work in animal law, and I was able to convert that to an attorney position. So now we have a third attorney. So it's great. And we're so busy all the time. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much for the presentation. It looks like your organization focuses mostly on companion animals and wild animals, but it seems like some of the biggest contributors to animal suffering are U.S. companies and the factory farm industry, and I'm wondering if your organization also does any work for farm animal welfare.
Very good question, and also very dear to my heart. I'm a vegan, and I've been a vegetarian since I was 14. So no, we don't. Farmed animals has never been an issue that IFAW works on. We do have policy statements against factory farming, and we do not invest in factory farming or intensive agriculture companies, but we do not have active projects.
Can you talk about the reasoning for that choice?
You know, I can't. And so this is actually, I mean, it's an interesting part of my role. I'm not a leader of our program decisions, you know. So even though I'm passionate about animal issues and I'm very interested, I'm not a decision maker on those program issues. Sometimes General Counsel are also vice presidents of their companies, and they get more involved in the strategy and decision making. But I am a General Counsel, and I am at the table for legal issues, but not strategic decisions. Maybe someday, but.
Thank you for being here.
Sure.
I would love it if you could talk a little bit more about your career path choices and your path into animal law, as well as perhaps any experiences you wish you had had before you went into animal law.
Mm-hmm. Great question. So I actually, you know, I've been passionate about animal issues since I was a little kid. When I was in law school, I wasn't really aware of animal law as a practice area. I was more interested in environmental issues and international issues, partly because I just didn't even conceive of it, which is kind of, you know, now there's so many student animal law groups and, you know, many law schools and courses taught, and that just wasn't the case for me in my law school experience. When I got to about my second year of law school and I realized how enormous my law school debt was going to be, and it was kind of a shock to the system. And I, at that point, decided that I would start out by going to a law firm, which was never my intention. I was fortunate to get a job at a law firm doing international arbitration, so there were some really cool international law aspects of that, and I actually liked the work. But it took me about 5 years at a law firm to pay off my high-interest student debt, which I was really committed to doing. And then, you know, what I always say is then it took me about another 4 years to find an animal law job, because in that time period, I had started volunteering at my local shelter, and I got, you know, really energized. I started getting involved with the American Bar Association Animal Law Committee, met people like Chris, and I realized, like, lawyers do this stuff. You know, lawyers work on animal issues full time. And it really, I mean, if I look back at my computer, you know, it was like, you know, job search 2011, job search 2012, these like folders, because it's, you know, you have to really be committed and persevere. And I think it's getting better and better, and I think that the animal law space is expanding. But during that time when I was knowing that I wanted to do animal law and looking for a job, I did everything I could to kind of brand myself as somebody who really, you know, cared about the issues. I did all my pro bono legal work at the firm was on animal law issues. All of my, you know, I did lots of volunteer time on non-legal issues with local animal groups. And I got involved with the American Bar Association Animal Law Committee. And I think I didn't end up getting my job through the Animal Law Committee, but I always say I don't think I would have gotten my job if not for the Animal Law Committee, because by the time I was applying for IFAW, I had this sort of legitimate history of working on animal law projects, and I knew enough about the field that I could convince them, like, hey, I'm a technically skilled attorney, but also I really care about your mission. So, yeah. So, and I think it's getting easier and easier, and I think that, you know, the more of us that are interested and that create these spaces. You also see lawyers interested in animal law who make their own way. You know, they set up their own practices, they, you know, do contract work, and they make it happen. So that's exciting too.
Thank you for your talk. I was interested to hear more about what pro bono legal support networks you use, both within the US and in all the other countries you operate in, and more generally what you could say about how students can get involved in a pro bono capacity in animal law.
Great, great. Yeah, I try to use, as any nonprofit, I try to use pro bono, you know, resources as much as I can. And again, like your law school classmates end up being a great resource for that. And then also there's just a lot of lawyers that care about animal issues and turn up at donor events, and you realize like, hey, this is a contract guy, maybe he could help. The big thing with pro bono projects is if it's an urgent, like high-risk project, you either need to make sure you have a pro bono team that's dedicated to approaching it like that, or you have to find good projects that are going to be meaningful for your company and they need to be done. But if it is on their back burner for several months, that's okay. Those are really good pro bono projects also. And in terms of getting involved with animal law as a law student, I really encourage you to sign up for the ABA Animal Law Committee. We're in the middle of some outreach to our law student members. We're trying to get our law student members involved in helping us update the Association for Prosecuting Attorneys has a state-by-state summary of animal cruelty laws on their website, which is one of the most used areas of their website by prosecutors. And those summaries haven't been updated in several years, so we're trying to get law student volunteers to help us do that. So that's an example. And we also have substantive subcommittees on the Animal Law Committee. We're looking for law student vice chairs of our subcommittees. We have an Animals and Agriculture subcommittee, Animals in Science and Technology, Wildlife, International Issues, Equine Law, probably some others I can't think of, but companion animals. So there's lots of ways to get involved, and I really encourage you to sign up. It's free, again, so please sign up. And there's some brochures down here.
So I have a question about being the Department of No. I was wondering, how often is it the case that you're saying no because you're likely to be challenged for a certain campaign initiative and you would lose in court? And how often is it the case that you think you likely would win in court, but the cost of litigating would be so expensive? And how would you do that cost-benefit analysis when those situations come up?
Very good question. Because actually, there's some situations, I won't talk about the specifics, but there's some situations where I end up saying, if we got sued over this, that would actually be really good publicity. And probably our damages are not that, what we might end up paying is not that high. So it does kind of become very clear to you, I think, when you're in-house. There's like the existential threats to the company where it comes before you and you feel, to your bones, like, no, like we can't do this. This could destroy us if it went wrong. And there's like some reasonable chance that it could go wrong. And those are the ones where you advise your executives very strongly. And if they ever disagreed with you, you would have to take it to the board, because that's, in your view, it's an existential threat. And then there's, other things where a lot of times you're just laying out for your CEO, senior management, like, here's kind of where I see the risk level. Here's where I see the risk of detection. Here's where I see, different things you could do. And, if it was up to me, I might choose this option. But if you have a higher risk, appetite on this one, you might choose that. And that they're supposed to be, your executives are supposed to be experts on risk management, and that's really their job to then make that decision once you've given them the advice.
I'll ask one last question.
Yeah.
You'd mentioned something about Egypt recently changing their rules regarding international nonprofits, and then it seemed like you might have jumped to something else. Do you remember exactly what Egypt's issue was?
We are not in Egypt, so it didn't affect me.
I bring this up because Professor Kristen Stilt did her PhD research in Egypt and worked with a lot of shelters there, and so she has her own nonprofit called Animal Diplomacy that helps fundraise for these shelters there, and she's recently been getting hassled about it by PayPal and others. There's some funding issues. So
interesting. So the president of Egypt signed a new law, I think fairly recently, that imposes restrictions on all domestic NGOs, regardless of where their funding comes from, by making their work subject to approval by a new regulatory body that is seen by some as a front for the country's security agencies. So that's the way these laws kind of work, is they create this new regulator who, is very closely tied to some arm of the government that might want to limit certain kinds of work. So, and it depends on what you're working on. And I think, in response to the farmed animal question from earlier, there are certainly areas of animal welfare that are more and less controversial. And I think that for animal groups that work on, animals in agriculture or animals in testing more than IFAW does, you have a different sort of risk profile and maybe a higher likelihood of getting interfered with by government and industry. So.
Phil Donahue.
So this is really not a legal question, but you talked about banning. So I'm thinking horns and tusks, you know. This question is really about black and white versus gray areas, and I'm just curious how many times different legal changes can have unintended consequences. So my example is my daughter spent 2 weeks in South Africa last year at a rhino preserve, and when she went, the intuitive thought was that legalizing the sale of these rhino horns would be a bad thing. But when she came back, she felt the opposite, and what they told her was, one, if it's legalized, then the prices may actually come down, which might lower the demand, and then two, they dehorn the rhinos to protect them from poaching, but then they have these horns, which if they could, you know, resell them, they'd be able to use those funds to protect the animals. So it was an interesting change of mindset there. So I was curious how many times you see, what you think of that in particular maybe, but just in general, how many times you see these kind of gray areas?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I am not an expert on the ivory trade, but I've now been around it, you know, for several years, and so. Yeah, I'd love to comment on that because it's a big point of discussion within IFAW. I actually just saw our Asia Regional Director speak about this yesterday. And she feels very strongly that in the context of the ivory markets, that by allowing a legal market for ivory, you're creating cover for black market ivory and illegal ivory to be sold. So, you know, when you have a situation where some ivory, depending on how old it is and how it was collected, is allowed to be sold, that's where you start having like a really healthy black market in ivory. So what her experience in China, and this is also our African staff feel this way too, that there was a total ban on international trade in ivory. And then there were a couple of, and I don't know the details on this, but there were a couple of times when the markets were opened and governments were allowed to sell their surplus ivory. And the effect of that on the ivory markets was just devastating, eventually for elephant populations, because what happened was all of that legal ivory sort of went into the market and generated opportunities for black market ivory to get back in. And it makes an enforcer's job much harder when some ivory is allowed, but some is not. It's really difficult to determine. So she thinks that by opening up the ivory trade at all, you're just empowering poachers. That's her belief. But of course, I mean, any advocacy organization, you have to be willing to say, okay, this is what we think is the right outcome for animals, and this is what we think is going to make sense. But you know, you have to revisit it in light of evidence.
I'll just add, there's even a group that was considering using cellular agriculture to sort of grow rhino horn. And I was at a conference where the person who was seeking to do that was on a panel with someone from Wild Aid who was just staunchly against it. Said they've been pretty successful at trying to squelch demand in like Cambodia and some other countries. And I think that's the problem. If you just increase the supply, you're just going to, you know, that's eventually going to grow demand, which is going to put more pressure on wild populations. And you also will end up with a bifurcated market where there's like the wild caught rhino horn will be sold at a premium compared to the farmed or cultured rhino horn, and that puts even more pressure on the wild communities. So there's I don't think there's any correct answer to it, but there's definitely lots of perspectives. Yeah. But do you want to say? Hand it over to Kate, our SALDF co-president.
Thank you again for coming.
Sure.
Can you all join me again in thanking Daina for coming?
Thank you.
There are sign-up sheets going around. If y'all haven't already signed up for our email list, we'll let you know when we have other speakers coming in and keep you updated. Thank you guys again.
Yes.
And please sign
Sign
up for
the ADA, please.